Every empire reaches a moment where its greatest achievement becomes its greatest vulnerability. Not during its rise, not during its wars, but after it has achieved global dominance. This is the phase history remembers incorrectly. People imagine collapse comes from invasion, rebellion, or sudden catastrophe. In reality, empires collapse after they have already won, after they have shaped the world in their image, after there is no rival left capable of challenging them directly. Global dominance creates a unique problem. When an empire becomes the center of trade, security, finance, and culture, it no longer has external pressure forcing adaptation. Competition fades, constraints loosen. The system begins optimizing for preservation instead of performance. At first, this feels like stability. Borders are secure, trade flows smoothly, institutions appear permanent. The empire sets rules instead of responding to them. But beneath that calm, the conditions that once made growth possible begin to reverse. Dominance removes urgency. It replaces discipline with assumption. When an empire controls the global order, mistakes are absorbed by the system it commands. Costs can be shifted outward. Consequences can be delayed. Inefficiencies can persist far longer than they should. This is where the final stage pattern begins. Not the collapse itself, but the sequence that only appears once an empire has no equal left to correct it. When power becomes automatic. When success stops being questioned. When the system stops preparing for limits. Rome reached this stage when it had no peer left in the Mediterranean. Britain reached it when the empire spanned the globe and the pound anchored world trade. The Soviet Union reached it when it controlled half of Europe and matched the United States militarily. Each believed dominance meant safety. It meant the opposite. Global dominance creates a system so large that its own maintenance becomes the primary objective. Expansion slows. Innovation becomes risky. Change threatens stability. The empire begins protecting what it has instead of building what it needs next. This is not decline yet. It is comfort. And comfort is the most dangerous phase any system can enter. To understand why every empire collapses after global dominance, you have to understand what dominance does to incentives, institutions, and decision-making. You have to look past the myths of invasion and betrayal and examine how control dissolves from the inside. The final stage pattern does not begin with weakness. It begins with supremacy. Once global dominance is established, the nature of risk changes. During rise and competition, mistakes are punished quickly. Rivals exploit weakness. Resources are scarce. Decisions matter immediately. Dominance removes those pressures. When an empire becomes indispensable to global systems, it gains the ability to externalize costs. Inflation can be exported. Debt can be absorbed by foreign demand. Military overstretch can be hidden behind alliances. Failures that would cripple smaller powers become manageable inconveniences. This creates a dangerous illusion. Leaders begin to believe the system is resilient by nature rather than by circumstance. Temporary advantages are mistaken for permanent features. Policies that work under dominance are assumed to work indefinitely. Rome debased its currency without immediate consequence because its trade network still required Roman coins. Britain borrowed heavily because global commerce depended on the pound. The Soviet Union sustained inefficiencies because its bloc had no alternatives. In each case, dominance delayed feedback. The system could absorb stress without signaling damage. That delay allowed problems to grow far larger than they otherwise would have. As feedback weakens, decision-making changes. Long-term planning gives way to short-term optimization. Preserving stability becomes more important than maintaining strength. Leaders manage appearances rather than fundamentals. Institutions adapt to this environment. They become risk-averse. Innovation threatens equilibrium. Bureaucracies reward conformity and punish disruption. The system begins defending itself rather than evolving. This is the critical shift. During ascent, systems adapt to survive. During dominance, systems resist change to preserve comfort. The qualities that created power are slowly replaced by those that protect it. The empire is not collapsing yet. In fact, it often appears more orderly than ever. Rules are standardized. Markets are deep. Military reach is unmatched. But beneath that order, flexibility is disappearing. The final stage pattern begins when dominance removes the urgency to adapt. By the time urgency returns, the capacity to respond has already been eroded. Part 3 of 10. As dominance settles in, expansion gives way to administration. Power no longer grows by conquering new ground or building new systems, but by managing what already exists. This seems natural. Large structures require maintenance. Complexity demands oversight. But this shift quietly changes how control works. During rise, authority is exercised through action. Decisions create results. During dominance, authority is exercised through process. Committees replace judgment. Procedures replace initiative. Metrics replace understanding. The empire begins governing itself through rules rather than outcomes. This is where inefficiency takes root. Not because people become less capable, but because systems reward safety over effectiveness. A decision that preserves stability is valued more than one that improves performance. Avoiding blame becomes more important than achieving results. Rome experienced this as its bureaucracy multiplied and military commands became ceremonial. Britain experienced it as imperial administration expanded faster than productive capacity. The Soviet Union experienced it as planning targets replaced reality on the ground. In each case, management grew while adaptability shrank. At this stage, power still exists, but it becomes slow. The system can respond to familiar problems, but it struggles with new ones. Unexpected challenges move faster than institutions designed for permanence. Feedback loops weaken further. Information is filtered as it moves upward. Bad news is softened. Warnings are delayed. Leaders make decisions based on models rather than conditions. Control becomes abstract. This is also where incentives misalign. Those who benefit from the system's complexity resist simplification. Careers, prestige, and influence become tied to maintaining the structure, not improving it. Reform threatens too many interests at once. The empire begins mistaking order for strength, stability for resilience, continuity for progress. From the outside, it still looks formidable. From the inside, it feels increasingly rigid. This rigidity is not collapse, it is preparation for it. Once systems lose the ability to adapt quickly, shocks begin to accumulate. And when shocks arrive faster than processes can respond, dominance starts to unravel. The final stage pattern advances not through failure, but through friction. As rigidity increases, the cost of maintaining dominance begins to rise faster than the benefits it provides. This is the moment when the empire's advantages turn into obligations. What once delivered leverage now demands constant upkeep. Military reach is a clear example. Global dominance requires presence everywhere, deterrence everywhere, readiness everywhere. During ascent, this presence creates security and influence. During dominance, it becomes a permanent expense with diminishing returns. The system spends more simply to prevent losses rather than achieve gains. The same applies to economic leadership. When an empire anchors global trade and finance, it must absorb shocks to keep the system stable. Crises elsewhere become its responsibility. Volatility is imported. Stability is subsidized. The burden of order shifts inward. At this stage, power still flows through the empire, but so does risk. The center becomes the shock absorber for the entire system. Every disruption requires intervention. Every failure demands a response. Doing nothing becomes more dangerous than acting. This changes how leaders think. Policy becomes reactive. Decisions are driven by urgency rather than strategy. Long-term costs are accepted to prevent short-term disruption. Control is preserved, but only by pulling resources forward from the future. Rome taxed its provinces harder to fund defense it could no longer win decisively. Britain borrowed relentlessly to maintain imperial commitments after its economic edge had eroded. The Soviet Union diverted ever larger shares of output to military and internal security as productivity stalled. The pattern is consistent. As dominance matures, sustaining control requires more input for less output. The system grows heavier. Each year of stability costs more than the last. This is where exhaustion begins. Not collapse, not crisis, but fatigue. Institutions tire. Populations grow wary. The margin for error narrows. The empire can still project power, but it must strain to do so. The final stage pattern advances when dominance stops generating surplus and starts consuming it. Once that threshold is crossed, control becomes a liability. And liabilities compound quietly until they can no longer be managed. As exhaustion sets in, the empire enters a phase where credibility becomes its most fragile asset. Power still exists, but belief in that power begins to thin. Not collapse of authority, but hesitation. Allies listen more carefully, rivals watch more closely. Neutral actors start planning for alternatives. Credibility is what allows dominance to function efficiently. When others believe the system will hold, they align with it voluntarily. They use its currency. They rely on its guarantees. They organize their future around its stability. Once that belief weakens, control becomes expensive. This stage is subtle because it does not announce itself. There are no declarations of disloyalty, no dramatic breaks. Instead, small adjustments appear. Trade settles in additional currencies. Supply chains diversify. Security arrangements include hedges. Commitments become conditional. The empire often misreads this as temporary uncertainty rather than structural shift. The response is reassurance, diplomatic pressure, incentives. These measures may slow the process, but they also reveal dependence on persuasion rather than assumption. Britain experienced this when the pound remained widely used but was no longer unquestioned. Rome experienced it when provinces began prioritizing local security over imperial coordination. The Soviet Union experienced it when allies quietly disengaged long before formal collapse. At this point, the system still works, but it no longer sets the default. Influence must be renewed repeatedly. Authority must be demonstrated rather than assumed. Each demonstration costs resources and accelerates fatigue. Internally, this stage deepens division. Citizens sense that promises are harder to keep. Outcomes become inconsistent. Confidence in institutions erodes further. The belief that the empire controls its own future weakens. This is the moment when dominance becomes conditional. It persists only as long as others continue to believe in it. And belief, once shaken, rarely returns fully. The final stage pattern moves forward when credibility, not capability, becomes the limiting factor. Once trust thins, control follows. Once credibility thins, the empire enters a phase where control must be actively maintained rather than passively assumed. This changes everything. Systems that once functioned automatically now require constant intervention to keep them aligned. Economic management becomes continuous. Markets no longer self-correct without guidance. Signals must be interpreted, shaped, and sometimes overridden. What used to be occasional adjustment turns into permanent oversight. Stability depends on action, not confidence. Politically, authority becomes louder but less effective. Declarations multiply. Messaging intensifies. Narratives are reinforced more aggressively because outcomes no longer speak for themselves. When results weaken, explanation replaces performance. This stage is deceptive because activity increases. From the outside, it looks like engagement, reform, responsiveness. Inside the system, it feels frantic. Every problem demands immediate attention. Long-term planning shrinks further because the present is always on fire. Rome responded to weakening control with more edicts, more taxes, more centralized commands. Britain cycled through governments and policies as it struggled to reconcile imperial commitments with domestic strain. The Soviet Union launched reform after reform, each failing to restore momentum. The underlying issue is not effort, it is alignment. Incentives no longer point in the same direction. What benefits the system in the short term undermines it in the long term. What preserves order today weakens capacity tomorrow. This is where control becomes brittle. It works only if everything goes right. It depends on perfect coordination in a system that has already lost flexibility. Any miscalculation now carries outsized consequences. At this stage, leaders often believe one decisive reform could restore stability, one reset, one breakthrough, one correction. History shows this hope is misplaced. The system no longer responds proportionally to change. The final stage pattern accelerates when intervention replaces confidence. Once a superpower reaches this point, it is no longer steering events, it is chasing them. The seventh phase begins when shocks stop being isolated events and start overlapping. Problems no longer arrive one at a time. They stack. Economic stress intersects with political strain. External pressure collides with internal fragmentation. The system loses the ability to sequence responses. In earlier stages, crises are spaced out. Recovery follows disruption. Confidence returns. In this phase, recovery never fully arrives before the next shock hits. The system is always stabilizing, never strengthening. This creates a new dynamic. Decisions made to address one problem worsen another. Measures taken to restore economic confidence fuel social tension. Actions meant to preserve order undermine legitimacy. Trade-offs become unavoidable, and every option carries visible cost. Rome experienced this when military threats, fiscal collapse, and political infighting converged. Britain faced it as war debt, decolonization, and domestic unrest collided. The Soviet Union reached it when economic stagnation, legitimacy loss, and geopolitical retreat happened simultaneously. At this stage, control still exists, but it is selective. Authorities choose which fires to fight and which to let burn. This is not strategy, it is triage. Resources are finite, attention is limited. Not everything can be saved. The public senses this immediately. When responses become inconsistent, trust collapses faster. People adapt individually. Institutions fragment. Informal systems replace formal ones. The system no longer coordinates behavior. It reacts to it. This is also when narratives fracture completely. There is no single explanation that satisfies everyone. Authority loses the ability to frame reality. Competing interpretations spread, accelerating division. The empire may still look powerful from the outside, but internally it feels unstable. Predictability disappears. Planning becomes impossible. Confidence gives way to caution. The final stage pattern tightens here. Once crises overlap faster than the system can resolve them, collapse is no longer a distant possibility. It becomes a matter of timing. When collapse finally accelerates, it does not announce itself with a single dramatic event. It reveals itself through loss of coordination. The machinery of power still exists, but it no longer moves together. Institutions act out of sync. Policies contradict each other. Authority fragments. At this stage, the system's greatest weakness is speed. Events move faster than decisions. Information arrives too late. Responses lag behind reality. What once felt like a decisive leadership now feels reactive and confused. Rome reached this point when provinces began acting independently, defending their own interests rather than following imperial command. Britain reached it when the pace of global change outstripped its ability to manage empire and economy simultaneously. The Soviet Union reached it when decisions from the center no longer translated into action on the ground. The defining feature here is loss of narrative control. When outcomes diverge too far from official explanations, trust evaporates. People stop waiting for guidance and start improvising. Markets price risk aggressively. Capital moves defensively. Alliances loosen. Attempts to restore control often backfire. Emergency measures feel permanent. Restrictions feel arbitrary. Enforcement feels selective. Each intervention reveals how little margin remains. This is also the moment when denial peaks, because acknowledging the breakdown threatens legitimacy. Leaders insist stability is returning, even as evidence mounts to the contrary. That gap between words and reality widens quickly. Once coordination fails, collapse becomes nonlinear. Small triggers cause large reactions. Confidence breaks unevenly, then all at once. The system still exists on paper, but it no longer governs behavior. Stage 8 is where power loses its coherence. It is not the end of the empire, but it is the end of its ability to control outcomes beyond its borders, and increasingly within them. From here, events no longer unfold according to plan. They unfold according to pressure. After control fractures, the world does not pause. It reorganizes. Power flows away from the center toward whatever structures can still provide stability, security, or opportunity. This redistribution happens unevenly, creating pockets of order surrounded by uncertainty. Former centers of authority struggle most in this phase because their systems were built for scale, not agility. Large institutions adapt slowly. Rules lag reality. By the time reforms are implemented, conditions have already shifted again. This is when informal networks gain influence. Local power brokers, private systems, regional alliances, and parallel markets fill gaps left by failing coordination. What works survives. What doesn't is abandoned, regardless of legality or tradition. For citizens, this phase feels disorienting. Expectations formed under global dominance no longer apply. Careers tied to old structures lose security. Savings become fragile. Long-term planning gives way to short-term positioning, and the empire's influence narrows rapidly. It may retain cultural presence, military capacity, or financial weight, but it can no longer set the rules. It responds to decisions made elsewhere. Its leverage becomes conditional. Rome fragmented into regional authorities that carried pieces of its system forward. Britain transitioned into a secondary power, aligned to a larger order. The Soviet Union dissolved into multiple states, each inheriting parts of the old structure, but none controlling the whole. This phase is often mistaken for recovery because activity resumes. But recovery implies return. What is happening instead is replacement. A different order takes shape, one that no longer centers the former superpower. The final stage pattern continues, here not through collapse, but through contraction. The empire still exists, but its era of dominance has ended. What remains is adjustment to a world that no longer orbits around it. The final stage is not marked by a single moment, announcement, or defeat. It is marked by acceptance. Not acceptance by leaders, but by the world. This is when global systems stop organizing themselves around the former center and begin operating as if it no longer defines the rules. At this point, the empire still speaks with authority, but fewer actors listen. It still possesses power, but power no longer translates into control. Decisions produce consequences, but not the ones intended. Influence exists, but it is situational, negotiated, and limited. History remembers this stage quietly. Rome did not fall the day it lost dominance. Britain did not collapse when the empire ended. The Soviet Union did not vanish when its influence waned. What ended was the assumption that they shaped the future by default. What follows is not chaos, but constraint. The former superpower must now live under rules it once enforced. It must adapt to systems it once designed. Its choices matter again because they are no longer cushioned by global dominance. This stage is uncomfortable, but it is not annihilation. Nations survive. People adapt. New forms of stability emerge. But the age of automatic control is over. For the present era, the lesson is not prediction, but recognition. Empires do not collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because the structures that once made dominance effortless stop working. By the time this becomes obvious, the transition is already underway. The final stage pattern is not a warning of imminent disaster. It is a reminder that no system escapes its own success. Global dominance carries the seeds of its end not through failure, but through excess, rigidity, and delayed consequences. Every empire that reached the peak believed it could remain there indefinitely. None did. Not because history is cruel, but because systems built to dominate eventually exhaust the conditions that made domination possible. That is why every empire collapses after global dominance. Not all at once, not the same way, but always, in the end, according to the same pattern.